During the First World War, just a few miles away from the fighting, there were soldiers playing football, jogging, jumping, even boxing in a makeshift ring. They were, most of them, discovering sports. It helped them forget all the violence and death. Surprisingly enough, the Great War played a crucial role in the history of sport. Troops from all over the world, from America, Britain, Holland, New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, Italy and France, turned to sport like never before. For 4 years, sport was a breath of fresh air that blew across the greatest, most tragic battlefield of the 20th century. This is the story of how it happened. June 1914. So, before the war, who was playing sports? Well, not many people actually. It took time, and in mainly rural Europe, leisure time was just for the privileged few. In 1914, the French were waiting for summer. That year, the Tour de France, a veritable 15-episode soap opera, was to truly go down in history in every sense. Sporting the favourites' colours were Belgium's Philippe Thys, the 1913 winner, and his fiery, moustached French rival Henri Pédissier, as well as former winners such as Octave Lapise or Luxembourg's François Faber. The tour was organised by Lotto, France's highest circulation sports daily, and its headline set the tone: "The great battle is on," meaning, of course, cycling. The 20th of June, the first stage, Paris-Le Havre, 388 kilometres. It'll be quite a tour, the spectators who line the roads were saying. The frontrunners were through Abbeville. It was 10:45 a.m. At that very moment in Sarajevo, shots rang out. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian Empire, and his wife were assassinated. Right then, though, the cyclists couldn't care less about events in Sarajevo. However, thanks to the rusty springs of diplomacy, the jostling for position and the downhill slope of human affairs, within a month, war was just down the road. As for the Tour de France, it was the Belgian Thys who won. No sooner were the cyclists off their bikes than they found themselves in uniform. Mobilization had begun. What were they thinking about as they marched along, these brave chaps? The same thing as their enemies. They were hoping for a quick victory and to be home by the end of the year. Henri Desgranges, the editor of Lotto and creator of the Tour de France, had dipped his pen in patriotic ink to write his editorial. He talks to his little cyclist chaps as if they were soldiers.
My little chaps, my dear little chaps, my French chaps, listen here. Those Prussians are bastards. You have to get 'em. Because if you don't get 'em, they'll get you. You've got a big match to play, but watch out. When you've got 'em at the end of your bayonet, they'll beg for forgiveness. Don't listen to 'em. Just thrust with no pity. Just imagine all humanity's sigh of relief if you win. It's up to you, my little chaps. My dear little chaps. My French chaps.
After 3 months of deadly combat, the war settled into its winter quarters. Most sportsmen had chosen to be in the front line. How many were killed in action? The brave heroes and the unknown soldiers. Soldier Jean Bouin, 5,000 meter silver medalist at the Stockholm Olympics, died in battle on the 29th of September 1914. He was a big star of athletics and one of the first sportsmen to be sacrificed in what would soon become a slaughter. He was 26 years old. The war put an end to the great upcoming sports events like the Five Nations Rugby Tournament and the 1916 Berlin Olympics. At the same time, though, it would play its part in the development of many sporting activities, bringing in a new wave of sportsmen from among the soldiers and the working class. A soldier looks out at us across a whole century, amused perhaps by the presence of the camera. They call them the poilus, the hairies, these men stuffed into uniform and with 70 pounds of gear on their backs. He'll turn away and disappear into the heart of darkness. From 1915 on, this static war got bogged down in the trenches. It was no kind of a life. The mud, the rats, the blood, the stink, the soldiers weeping or screaming. To relieve the troops, the military authorities arranged a rotation system. The men spent 10 to 15 days at the front, then were billeted behind the lines. A kind of life grew up, a monotonous one, around meal times, the drudgery and the exercises that the men quickly tried to get out of. But they were allowed some distractions. They helped them not to think. They soothed the disappointment of the leave they were often promised and never got. In a soldier's billet, the worst enemy is boredom. These two playing with their guns or the camera are trying to kill time. To keep busy, some sports-loving foot soldiers brought a football along with them. These previously unseen and ordinary-looking images in fact show the origin of friendly games. Right behind the lines, everywhere there were sporty squaddies teaching their pals from the trenches to play. It was a new dawn for the troops. Elsewhere, the ball was oval. Corporal Andrion, a former rugby player, tells of a great moment.
It's very relaxing to play rugby from time to time. It doesn't tire the men, it energizes them and gets their articulations working, which they really need. And tackling your mates is great. I've got a few friends here on the campaign who'd never played this noble game, and now they're just fanatical about it.
Sports helped them forget the war, and they wanted more of it. Enthusiastic young officers suggested replacing square bashing with sports. The High Command knew this would make life easier for the troops, and they agreed. These bodies glowing with energy make quite contrast to being stuck in the trenches. Being free to move made the troops feel human again. Sport was just a short respite for the infantrymen, though, and all too soon over. Then it was back into uniform again, back to the front line, and back to constant mortal danger. In the spring of 1915, a legionnaire from Luxembourg called Faber was billeted in the Artois region of France. Hard-working and built like a mountain, he'd won the Tour de France in 1909. In the 1914 Tour, he won 2 of the stages, then enlisted in the Foreign Legion. On the 8th of May, on learning he'd become the father of a baby girl, he wrote to his wife,
There, I was right. You see, my instincts are never wrong. It's a girl. How is she? How did it go? How are you? I think the big push won't be long coming. Here at the camp, we're all highly prepared, and I don't think the Boche are going to enjoy it. I'm feeling confident and hoping to get through it all. Your big man who adores you.
In the next day's assault, Legionnaire François Faber fell under enemy fire. He was 20 years old. In 1916, with Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, real life was further away than ever. The rise of sports was cut short by the intensity of the fighting. It was the British who got things going again. Every soldier who went up to the front was plunged into the poignant solitude that comes with facing death. These are soldiers too, but they're on leave and divided into 2 teams. Ball games had started out as just a pastime, but now they were being played on a proper football pitch and wearing football gear. Up near the front, sport was now more than just a way to forget about the war. All the troops now took part, as this officer explained.
In some units, they're playing football and organising matches. More and more senior officers are going to them and say they're very good for the men's morale. Elsewhere, they're setting up rings, and the noble art is attracting many enthusiasts.
This footage is from 1916. We don't know exactly where or when. It is, however, very special. It shows how much sport was making its mark on army life. In an improvised stadium in a park, the men, from their touching clumsiness obviously beginners, are taking part in athletics trials. Most of them were farmers or working men, discovering sport for the first time. Working all the time in the fields or at the factory, how could they have had time for any sporting activities? Now they were giving it all they'd got. These were men who really needed to feel human again. This long line of figures was heading straight into hell. It was 1916, Verdun. When the guns were silenced, there it all was. The dead and the living, the grief and the fear, and the trenches that at some point you'd have to leave and risk your life. It was on every soldier's mind, that race against the clock, against death.
In a few moments, we'll have to run 200 meters over open ground under fire. If we hurry, it'll take us a minute and a half. Fit men could certainly manage it in 50 seconds. That's a clear gain of 40 seconds of killing time. 10 cartridges per enemy rifle and 300 machine gun rounds. That isn't armchair strategy, it's a cold-blooded calculation, made just 200 meters from the Boche, while waiting for the starter's gun.
Verdun was in ruins. But what about the health of those roped into a war that shows no sign of ever ending? At least they were alive. For the moment. The army was starting to run short of men. So they called up the reservists, youngsters of 18 or 19. Muscles and moustaches, the very picture of virility at the time. The race was on to train physical education coaches. From May 1916 on, they were bringing in new troops who had to be got into shape before being sent up to the front. They got them running, jumping, lifting, climbing. Or learning to fence with a bayonet. A sport of war that would later lead to official championships. And there was grenade throwing, which a lieutenant here enthuses about.
Grenade throwing is a real sport with real champions. It's a very important part of our sports training because we have great need of well-built, well-trained men with good lung power and staying power. These qualities that our young sportsmen have mean they've become very important when it comes to grenade battles.
At the request of those young sportsmen, grenade throwing was included in the military sports championships. The winners were throwing averages of 54 meters. And in the speed and precision trials, the champions could throw 45 grenades in 60 seconds. In war, though, it wasn't a competition. A grenade was a weapon and was constantly used to devastating effect. From the very start, it was the British troops who gained everyone's respect, including all the other men. People admired their courage. They were known as the Tommies. 4 million of them landed, with a lot of military strength, style, and sportsmanship. The Tommies were actively encouraged to play sports by their military command. It was considered important to their well-being, to their military training, and to their group morale. And this attitude influenced the officers of all the other armies. A soldier who was a sportsman might well make a better fighter. On the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme kicked off in a most extraordinary act of both sportsmanship and tragedy. With his men frozen in fear at the idea of going over the top, a British captain, Neville, offered a reward to any soldier who could get to the enemy lines dribbling a football. At 7:27, the 8th Battalion launched their assault. When a man fell, another would replace him and take the ball. Captain Neville never saw his men take a village from the Germans. On this 1st of July, he was one of the 20,000 British troops to die in combat. It was the British Army's darkest hour. The war killed so many, but it also left dreadful traces in the minds and on the faces of the wounded. These men may look more or less human again, but the war has marked them for life. In 1916, a soldier called Eugène Criqui was found on the battlefield close to death, his lower jaw shattered and his tongue pierced by a bullet. After 2 years of operations and therapy, and against medical advice, he resumed his pre-war career as a boxer. With all his training, he was soon winning again, in the only way he could, by getting in the first punch. In 1923, he became world featherweight champion by beating the American Kilbane with a knockout. They called him Iron Jaw. The Battle of the Somme went on for 4 months and left 450,000 dead. A priest performs the last rites out in the middle of nowhere, for there was nothing left. No nature, no landscape, hardly anyone still alive. Yet still the living took care of their dead. They buried the German dead too, or with no sense of pride, took their photo. An 18-kilometer cycling event was organized within range of the shelling, on regimental bicycles and with a squad of delighted soldiers. The practice of sport was approved by the French army in 1917 as indispensable to the troops' morale. How they wished they were somewhere else, these soldiers marching to the slaughter of the trenches, where so many had lost their lives. At Vincennes, near Paris, the France-New Zealand rugby game featured two military teams made up of soldiers on special leave. The sports authorities had launched a big campaign to popularize the game. Entry was free. 60,000 spectators were transfixed by the All Blacks' famous haka. In sporting terms, it was France's greatest defeat of the war, 40-0. The captain that day was Maurice Broyot. A three-quarters wing, but also an aviation ace with 35 victories. 6 months later, he died in battle. French rugby paid the heaviest price of any sport during the war. 121 of its best players would never come home. "1917 was the year of the Chemin des Dames offensive. But at the end of this road lay a terrible defeat for the Allied armies. In just 2 months, 200,000 soldiers were killed. As for those who'd been fighting for 3 years, they'd simply had enough. They felt they were just lambs to the slaughter. They'd had enough of the rats, of the lousy food, of hardly getting any leave, the lot. Insubordination was on the rise, as we hear from this member of the 36th Infantry Regiment.
We refused to go up to the front line Tuesday night. We didn't want to march. They take us for cattle, and there's not enough to eat. We were pretty much on strike, and a lot of other regiments have done the same. You might not even get this letter. They might open them all and keep back or burn the ones that talk about what happened. I don't give a damn. I've had enough of their war.
General Philippe Pétain took command of the French army. He listened to the men and heard their complaints. Pétain, in fact, put a stop to the mutinies by improving living conditions for his troops, both at the front and behind the lines. From then on, the men at the front would get a full 3 days of rest. Sports were on the increase, at the initiative of the senior officers, who allowed their men unrestricted access to sporting activities. They recognized that sport contributed to both physical strength and all-round well-being. In the wake of the mutinies, there had never been so many officers at the games, nor so much contact between the regiments. In 1917, the War Ministry ordered 5,000 footballs to be delivered to the troops. Sport was now part of the war effort. The tragic conflict was also played out in the skies. Flying was now one of the arts of war, whereas it had recently been seen as a sport. Wartime aviation attracted its own champions. In 1916, the racing cyclist Octave Lapisse was trained in aerial combat. He obviously had a head for heights. An excellent climber, he'd won the 1910 Tour de France, the first tour to include a Pyrenees mountain stage. Cresting a particularly high pass and red with fury, he yelled at the organisers, "You are murderers." On the 14th of July 1917, Lapis's plane crashed after a fight. A cycling hero in life, in death he was now a true hero.
Lapis, like so many of our champions, has just heroically met the finest of deaths. We've lost an ace among aces, one of the best of us, a perfect, complete athlete, as well as an intelligent man. We all mourn the loss of Lapis.
Lapis was almost 30 when he died. From the summer of 1917, 2 million American troops would land in battle array. The French call them the Sammies. The Sammies landed in France with their very American style of army life. Bare-chested, their heads shaved, the 1st Infantry Division stationed at Meuse kept up a strict regime of exercise, discipline and esprit de corps. The Sammies brought with them a lot of money. All along the front line they built their barracks, more than 1,500 of them. A kind of little America on French soil. They chewed American gum. They listened to American music. They smoked American cigarettes and read American books. Their YMCA looked after the religious side of things as well as the sports. The Sammies arrived with their American sports and the equipment to play them. They brought hoops and balls for their basketball games. They played baseball too, but it was just too American for all tastes, and it never really caught on in Europe. The US also sent over 100,000 African-American soldiers, but they mainly held logistical posts. This was segregationist America's way of making sure there wouldn't be any Black War heroes. When it came to sport, the black soldiers usually stuck together. In this village square near Verdun, a curious audience watches them boxing. There's a big knockout punch, but no real harm done. After all, this was sport, not war. Between June 1917 and November 1918, 120,000 Sammies died in battle. When it left, America, with its competitiveness, with its stake on playing the game, would bequeath to the old continent the richness of its sporting culture. He was a star, and this smile, one of the most famous in all showbiz, belonged to the boxer Georges Carpentier. At the outbreak of war, he was only 20, but he'd done a lot of living. He was the son of a miner, but with his shining talent, he preferred the boxing ring to the mine shaft. He was European heavyweight champion in 1913. He was a smooth talker, a charmer, a prince, and the cameras loved him. War offered other ways to fight, and Georges chose aviation, not without its risks. Lieutenant Carpentier escaped death many times to obtain the French Military Cross and the Military Medal. In 1917, Carpentier was teaching the noble art to other soldiers and staying in shape while he waited for better days to come. At the request of the High Command, he toured a boxing demonstration around the provincial camps. It was a recruiting drive for sports. He was immensely popular, and would be even more so after the war. In 1920, he would be world middleweight champion. The next year, he would square up to Jack Dempsey in Jersey City, USA, in a sea of 120,000 spectators at the World Heavyweight Championship.
And down goes Carpentier. 1, 2.
A US journalist would say that Dempsey that day was the strongest, but Carpentier was the better fighter.
He's up just in time. And Dempsey goes after him and down.
But Georges went down to a knockout in the fourth round.
5, 6. He's trying to get up. 8, 9, 10, and out. And Jack Dempsey remains heavyweight champion of the world.
After boxing, Carpentier went into the movies in Hollywood, into music hall on Broadway, and lived 1,000 lives before he died at 81. But in 1917, the war was still raging. Sometimes a puff of wind was all that stirred in the hearts of the dead villages. But the heart of sport was still beating. At the front, more and more soldiers were playing, and in Paris, there was a new spirit in the air. War or no war, in 1917, Paris was a city in perpetual motion. Paris had never held its breath. You could see the troops on leave passing through town, a bit lost in all the coming and going. Or a young soldier flirting with a girl in the middle of it all. The ever more numerous sporting events were part of a new wave of patriotism. The war effort seized on it. Money had to be raised. All the propaganda was aimed at showing the public that these soldiers they saw playing football would be able to tough it out in the trenches. Meanwhile, the war kept up its toll on human life. In 1918, sports attracted more new followers and gave birth to new competitions. The troops were now nearing complete physical exhaustion. But when it came to sports, they'd get their second wind. Here, each and every soldier is wearing a race number. This is Colombes, near Paris, where the 1900 Olympic Games were held. Now it was where the biggest wartime sporting competition ever set against each other the British, the Americans, the Italians, the Portuguese and the French. It's a long way from sport's clumsy beginnings. For the athletes, it meant a bit less time in the trenches, worried sick and waiting for a bullet. The 1418 war was a world war, total, industrial, and fatally destructive. But out of it was born a great sporting event. Football's Coupe de France. "48 teams took part in the first Coupe de France, in memory of Charles Simon, who died in battle on the 15th of June 1915. Simon was a big football fan who, before the war, had founded the forerunner, the French Football Federation. In his honour, the competition bore his name before becoming the Coupe de France. Paris, the 5th of May 1918. The first final in front of 2,000 spectators, and Olympique de Pantin in white beat Le Football Club de Lyon 3-0. The teams were mostly made up of young players. The older ones are off at war. The competition still goes on today and will soon have its centenary. How many soldiers were aware that in 1917 in Paris there was an all-women football match between two teams from the Femina Sport Club? In their way, these young women were pioneers. There were obviously girls from good families whose brothers and cousins were off at the war. Doubtless, they'd all already mourned the loss of a loved one, for the Great War spared nobody. (1917 to 1918) saw the beginning of all-female competitions in athletics, football and cross-country. Doctors at the time, however, were claiming that all this was dangerous for women's reproductive systems. Pierre de Coubertin, the father of the modern Olympics, wasn't exactly against it, but he wasn't keen either.
The role of women should be, like in the tournaments of old, to crown the victors. As I see it, the true Olympic hero is an individual male adult.
Right after the war, 1,200,000 spectators watched an all-women football game between a side selected from France's best players and an English side from Preston in the striped jerseys. Did the girls have a laugh at the Baron de Coubertin's expense? Who knows? In the early autumn of 1918, the war was not yet at an end. The aviator Roland Garros was an accomplished sportsman, a university cycling champion, rugby player and athlete. In 1913, he'd been the first to make an aerial crossing of the Mediterranean. On the 25th of October 1918, he was not yet 30 years old when his plane exploded after a battle. He gave his name to the famous tennis tournament in Paris. He died just 2 weeks before the end of the war. The 11th of November 1918 in Paris. On this Armistice Day, the streets are full of joy rather than sadness. Later, all the tears will be shed for the 18 million dead, both civilian and military. At the year's end, the still mobilized troops play football and keep the fun going with a snowball fight. Among the war dead were thousands of the great names of sport. And yet, the years ahead would be among the greatest for sport that Europe had ever known. The flower of military athletics on parade. 1,415 participants, 18 nations, 90,000 spectators. From the 22nd of June to the 6th of July 1919, the Inter-Allied Games were held in Paris, the military version of the Olympics. It was the first post-war international sporting event. The Games were presented as an occasion of fraternity, but it was a fraternity of victors. The countries that lost were not invited. It was the Americans who paid for the construction of the Stade, which was named after General Pershing, commander of the American army throughout the conflict. The general awarded the medals in person. The Americans came first in the nation's ranking, ahead of the French and the Italians. When the Tour de France got back on the road in 1919, its route had changed a bit thanks to the war. Now it passed through Alsace and Lorraine, the two areas of Germany that were now French once again. It was a meagre pack of just 69 cyclists at the starting line. But then there were so many absent friends. During the war, French cyclist Lucien Petit-Breton had spoken of a rosy future.
Men will have learned how better to suffer. They'll remember their suffering in the trenches, and it will give them new strength. When peace comes, everyone will be so happy to live without fear, without regret, that all will seem simple and easy. Then cycling will enjoy a golden age.
On the 27th of July 1919, a happy crowd at the Parc des Princes hailed the victory of Belgium's Firmin Lambeau. After the war, sport enjoyed a genuine boost in popularity. Sports were no longer the preserve of just a few. They were now open to all social classes, as well as to women and the young. Football, so popular with the troops during the conflict, now became the #1 sport, the one that won the public's favour. And that's one of the most notable legacies of the Great War. After the 1418 conflict, it was the stadiums that replaced the battlefields. The human body could now achieve feats of athleticism instead of military ones. In the minds of the crowd, the sporting champion had replaced the soldier hero. The athlete Joseph Guillemot first discovered sport at the front, then lost a lung due to a mustard gas attack. In 1920, at the Antwerp Olympics, he took the gold medal in the 5,000 meters. Guillemot was an Olympic champion. He'd come such a long way. It was as if sport had triumphed over war.